Jimmy Carter was perhaps the most successful ex-president in American history, winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his work promoting human rights and economic and social development. But his single term as president is largely remembered as a series of failures and missteps, sometimes literally. Gas lines, a record-high combination of unemployment and inflation called the Misery Index, and Americans being held hostage by Iranian revolutionaries for over a year all fueled the perception that Carter was a weak and ineffective leader. When he collapsed during a 6-mile run, it personified for many the exhaustion of the country under his leadership. But there was at least one way in which Carter excelled as president. He was, in the words of 2002 Nobel-Winning Economist Vernon Smith, the great deregulator. Carter forced the airline industry, along with interstate trucking and freight rail, to compete for business with powerful and positive effects that continue to this day. Reason talked to Smith about Carter, whom he met at a White House event for American Nobel Prize winners. Vernon Smith, thanks for talking to Reason.
Well, it's great to be here.
One of your co-Nobelists, the year you won the Nobel Prize, was Jimmy Carter. What was your impression of Jimmy Carter?
Actually, very favorable. See, George Bush was president, and he invited the 9 American Nobelists to the White House. So I met Jimmy Carter. And I told him, I said, you know, you're my favorite Democratic president. So I didn't make much of a commitment there. He said, well, why? I said, because you deregulated the airlines, railroads, and trucks. I said, everybody recognizes that as the most spectacular deregulation event in history. I mean, it's just incredible what happened to those industries that were being crippled by regulation. And he smiled, he said, we're very proud of that.
Do you remember what was flying like before deregulation?
I remember paying quite a lot to fly. I would give lectures in Winnipeg, Regina, a bunch of Canadian universities. And I remember flying from those. Those cities weren't very far apart, but it'd be $800 or $900. And the interesting thing, on Saturdays and Sundays, those planes were typically empty, but in America, they were required to fly them. You see, in order to hold the route, you get the right to fly it only if you always provide the service. So all that interference, it was not sensitive to the fine structure you see of consumer demand. And
a lot of people still make this complaint, though, that before deregulation, you know, it was classy to fly and people wore suits and ties and that you had real meals on the plane.
This is the atmosphere on a jet clipper flight. Delicious food adds to the enjoyment. It's prepared in 4 simultaneously operating galleys where dishes can be cooked in 5-minute ovens.
And now, after deregulation, it's like riding the bus.
That's what people are willing to pay for. You see, they like those cheap tickets, and if they're buying them, they're gonna get just the service that they're buying. And before that, airlines couldn't compete on price, so they competed on meals. I remember flying American, and if you ordered it ahead of time, they had a seafood tray that was just really great. You can't get any of that kind of stuff now.
Yeah, but if you're paid $800, you might as well have a good meal, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did the end of nationally regulated interstate trucking change the economy?
Well, it was just a whole lot more price competitive. And trucks were now going on the more profitable routes and also profitable commodities. They were pricing it to clear the market, and a lot of the new goods would pay more for rapid deliveries. And then also you had the railroads starting to experiment with hauling trailers on flat cars. And the whole piggybacking industry now, as it was called then, was created. And so for long distance hauls, it paid, you see, to use the railroads and not the highways. And then we had fishyback come in. I mean, these containers went overseas and in boats. And now look at the cargo, these huge floating carriers that have those containers. Those are just really incredible what's happened. One of the things I learned from Jimmy Carter was that, you know, he's trying to bring medical health benefits to poor populations all over the world. What's his biggest impediment in these countries? Governments. Jimmy Carter was discovering the problem with governments because the typical government in these countries, they don't want him to come in. Why would the Iraqs want him to come in and help the Kurds, you see, with medical stuff? So he was having a lot of trouble with the World Health Organization, getting access to actually the people that needed help, because he could only get there through the government. And so that was an interesting story. I wonder if it would have changed his ideas as a president if he'd had that experience first.
How should we remember Jimmy Carter?
As a great deregulator.